Good morning, friends. We are continuing with the art of supportive leadership, how to work with people. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. We are your children, making our way through this world as best we can. Help us when we stumble and fall. Lift us to our feet again. Give us the strength to move forward. Help us never to give up, but always to keep foremost in our thoughts and feelings your infinite love, your perfect light. Om. Peace. Amen. So, the art of supportive leadership continues. Yesterday we read my favorite line in this book. At this point, almost any action short of utter lunacy will be better than no action at all. This is the point at which never allow a group's creativity to become stifled by an excess of words. This is just incredibly important in all group interactions. Sometimes more words suck the energy out of the room instead of adding to it. As a leader, never allow a group's creativity to become stifled by an excess of words. It may be argued that action without careful deliberation may prove not only hasty but harmful. In fact, however, action itself often has a way of clarifying issues. Obviously, one shouldn't, figuratively, leap blindfolded off a precipice, but one should at least test the possible avenues of descent instead of standing about endlessly theorizing. The most important thing in leadership is to keep the creative energy flowing. As long as it continues to do so, that flow will itself generate ideas. It will melt away obstacles. Just a moment. It will melt away obstacles, open up new possibilities, and create a host of undreamed of opportunities. So this is the point that I know has been emphasized a number of times as we've gone through this chapter, but it simply can't be said often enough. Very often people define leadership as protecting you from every possible calamity that might come. And so the leader gets in his mind that my job is to point out the obstacles, and my job is to say what might go wrong, and then my job is to protect us from that happening. There's a tendency that people get in leadership, as Swami puts it this way: it's easier to say no than it is to say yes. Because if you say no, then you haven't risked anything. And it's calamitous in a leader to get in the habit of saying no. Bureaucrats, governments, they all just say no. When we were at Ananda Village back in the early 80s, and we were late 70s actually, we were trying to get a master plan for the development of the community approved by the county. And there was this gentleman who was in charge of our case. And as it happened, he was a big man. And we all began to feel that as soon as he got our applications, he would put them on the seat of his chair and he would put the heavy weight of his body just on them, just to sort of stop whatever we had in mind. He did not know how to handle us. He wasn't competent to do the kind of creative city planning that was required to accommodate, what Ananda was and wanted to be. So it was just easier for him to just constantly put up a stop to it. So not only, of course, we, as I've talked about in other contexts, Swami actually started a political movement in the county to get the leadership of the planning department changed, because that man was a subordinate to his boss, a woman who was doing exactly the same thing to us. And Swami saw the only way to move forward was to get rid of these people. And the grand jury in the county had already recommended that the director be fired, but it took our political activism to actually get them to act on that recommendation, because they were following what they thought was the policy of leadership, was to avert disaster, anticipated possible maybe disaster. So as a leader, among many qualities that you have to have as a leader, is you have to have courage. You have to have the courage just to go forward, just to figure out, well, this is a good idea, let's try it. Now, you don't just take your whole group and throw yourselves over the cliff without any net below. Swamiji was a marvelous blend of courage, imagination, hugeness of vision, an enormous sense of the possible. But he was also, I don't want to exactly use the word conservative, but he was never foolhardy. He never risked everything on one idea. He always had a little bit on the side, a little bit of energy on the side, another possibility on the side, a separate bank account where there was still just a little money saved, not during the years he was building Ananda. During the years he was building Ananda, he would run his bank account sometimes down to $1.50 by the time he paid all his bills. But once we were established and there was more to lose, he never risked it all. But there is this principle, and this is a fundamental principle of leadership, which is things clarify as you begin to act on them. We often think that we can't act until everything has been clarified, but sometimes only action and the experience it brings you and how that experience changes you, and then that will begin to clarify the step that comes next. And it goes even farther than that. Swami used the phrase, which we've made the title of this segment, which is energy has its own intelligence. This is a very, very interesting aphorism that has been fundamental to a great many of the things that Ananda has been able to accomplish, and that I myself have experienced in my life. Let's just start. Because once we're all working together, or I'm working alone together trying to create something, let's say in writing, it's like once I break the dam and let the flow of energy start coming through, or the group starts sort of working together, you begin immediately to see what's working and what isn't. And it's also, when you say energy has its own intelligence, it's also, there's a flow of grace that gets involved there. There's an aphorism that Swamiji wrote, and he said, when you're trying to get guidance, he said, raise your energy level. And you often raise your energy level by taking some kind of positive, constructive action, because when you raise your energy level, you get to a higher vibration. And when you get to a higher vibration, often intuitive realities that you couldn't perceive when we're fear-driven trying to get everything settled ahead of time, that's a lower vibration than thoughtful, courageous, not lunatic, but thoughtful and courageous action to move things forward. Then we begin to see, well, that worked, that didn't work. When Swami Kriyananda was living in San Francisco in the summer of 1979 and was trying to see if we could establish an Ananda center there in San Francisco. And the project had started in this 3-bedroom house in this neighborhood in San Francisco, which is called the Sunset, which is a nice neighborhood, but kind of I would say middle class is perhaps the right word, although I'm sure now property values have made all those houses just for millionaires. But at the time, it was a family neighborhood. The house was simply unsuited for what we were trying to do. I think there were like 20 people living in this 3-bedroom house. We'd made I say we, I was semi part of it. The garage had been turned into a dormitory, literally they had put tents on the flat roof of the house. Swami, for a time, was living in his motorhome with a long extension cord plugging into the house. The neighbors were glued to their windows all the time, just watching what we were doing. And, you know, it just wasn't coming together. There were a lot of obstacles. The house was so small and the parking was so limited that we couldn't have any events in the house. And that meant anytime we wanted to have any kind of a class, we had to rent another place, which was expensive, and then we had to move everything, which was time-consuming and cumbersome. It just wasn't suitable, and Swami had another word for it, which is there wasn't enough magnetism there. When you saw us crowded into that little house, it didn't make you feel like something really wonderful was happening that I wanted to be a part of. And so we had no money, we had no sort of prospects, but Swamiji called a realtor, or someone called a realtor and said, you know, this house is not suitable, let's see if there's anything else. And the first house that was shown to the group was a 45-room mansion at the corner of Broadway and Fillmore, one in from the corner of Broadway and Fillmore, one of the most prestigious addresses in the city of San Francisco. And it was an 80-year-old house, so it wasn't like it was luxurious because it was huge, and it was luxurious because of the neighborhood, and it was luxurious because it was an elegant house. We had no money, and just the move-in costs were $12,000, which was a whole lot more money than we had. And the rent was, I think, 5 times the rent that we were paying for the little house. But Swami just said, this feels like what we should do, let's go forward. And so we didn't sit around and say, what if, what if, what if? Swami just called a meeting. He called everyone he knew in San Francisco, we all did, who had ever been involved in our work there that summer. And there were other people saying, like, this is crazy, literally, this is crazy. This is madness. How can we ever do this? Swami just called all these people together, and in a matter of an hour raised $12,000, and about 10 people were ready to move in. And just like that, because he put out the energy with that kind of force, and it creates magnetism. Energy itself creates magnetism. You're sitting there saying, we don't have the energy to do this, we don't have the magnetism. Magnetism is really the word. Swami says wealth is not accumulated resources. Wealth is the capacity to magnetize what you need at the time you need it. And you do that by raising energy. And also, Swami felt that it was the right thing for us to do, but it was also, this is how we're going to find out. We can call a meeting of everyone we know. We had it in the house. I wasn't present. They had it in the house. And everybody's sitting here looking out through the dining room windows at a view of the bay in which you can see both the Golden Gate and the Bay Bridge, because we were at the top of the hill there. And people are sitting there. It created its own energy. And all of a sudden, people were willing to donate money. All of a sudden, people could see the possibility of it. Now, if he just sat there and called people and tried to figure out, do we have enough money? Where can we borrow it from? What will we do if we can't pay the rent? You know, giving up this one first. Should we give up? You could have just done that, but he didn't. Instead, he just acted boldly. Energy had its own intelligence. It showed us sort of how the project was going to evolve, and it gives God a chance to work through you. Now, I repeat, because it's very true, Swami was never foolhardy. He was never foolhardy. But what happens when you start operating this way is you begin to get a feeling for it. That's the only way I can put it. You have to be practical in your idealism, and then you have to trust God both. And you begin to get a feeling for when the magnetism is going to unfold if you just have the nerve to start. And you just take it one step at a time. You don't start by selling everything you own and standing on the street. You go out. You make a little bit of an adventure. You give it a try. You see if it's going to work. But moving the energy and giving people new experiences, this is what Swami says, whenever you feel that the leader's job is to keep the creative energy flowing. Creative is also a very important word there. Because when people are being creative, I think exactly how to say this. I was in a situation where I had a certain number of ideas about something I thought could work. And it wasn't completely formed, it was just sort of beginning to form. And one of the people in the meeting immediately started just going like this, like, well, that part of it won't work, and this is going to be a problem here, and that won't work. And immediately it's like I could just feel all my energy just go, pff, just like a pricked balloon, just all of a sudden deflating. When we worked with Swami and his creative energy, we all had to learn sort of how to support him in his creative flow, even if we weren't certain of what it was that he was doing, even if we had clear, obvious perceptions that something was going to have to be changed. He trained us over time that you can give feedback, but you need to give feedback in such a way that it increases the energy rather than stopping it. Swami accused me once of being negative, and I was rather surprised because I didn't think of myself that way. And what he said is, he said, you know, it's not like a deep quality in you, but sometimes you're so, and this is how he said it, factual. Oh, I do understand that. In an effort to be helpful, I want to point out the facts. Well, you know, there's rules about this. Well, you know, we only have this much money. You know, well, these people, and you know, just sort of like being so factual. That delicate flower of creativity. But see, energy has its own intelligence. And if you let the creative flower continue to expand itself, almost always, if you're working with a competent group, those weaknesses will reveal themselves. But if you reveal them in such a way that the energy is slammed shut, then there's no solutions. But if they come out while the energy is flowing, that very flow of energy often in itself generates an idea that won't come to you if you've closed off the energy. So all I can say with my whole heart is experiment with this. Because when you capture this, and I'm a gross amateur compared to Swamiji. He was marvelous at keeping the energy going, of knowing when to act, but it's definitely a skill that a leader needs to develop. So now we've reached the end of this particular chapter, so let me summarize the rules, and this time he calls them rules. I've noticed and have enjoyed pointing out that the summary of every chapter is articulated in a different way. This is chapter 9, the need for action, not talk. And he says, remember these rules then. 1, leadership means action, not merely good ideas for action. So that's what we've been talking all along. Sometimes people think all the leader has to do is throw the ideas out into the room. But the leader also has to translate those ideas in practical terms that other people can be excited by. And the leader has to have the courage to make things happen. You know, these days, everybody's, let me think how to say that. It's like the end of the meeting has to be that we're going to do something. I know this is all systematized. You end a meeting now and you have action items and so on like that. But it has to be more than just an organizational method or this is how we always end our meetings. It has to be really like, I'm going to do something about this. Swami's way, often, we'd have, he would say, why don't you come to tea at 4 o'clock? That would be how you would do it. Then a group would gather and he would talk about something that he thought might be a good idea for us to work with. He rarely really tried to pin down the next steps in a large group. There would be a consensus about what we were going to do, and then those individuals who would be most responsible would then carry on with what it was that was happening, because too many ideas in a room, you often end up, everything has to be balanced by everything else. He always knew that once you really got down to the details and you really wanted something to happen, you needed to have usually just 1 or 2 people who are really going to make it go forward. Leadership means action, not merely good ideas for action. So look back and see what you've been able to make happen or not, and then contemplate these rule number 1 and see if you can become better at it. Number 2, don't waste so much energy in planning that you have none left over for acting on your plans. You know, people get exhausted. And people get exhausted, especially when you have a few resources on your team. And you want to have a few resources on your team. Resources, people whose minds can work quickly, who can see what needs to be done and then become ready to do it. Sometimes there's an inclination in groups to bring the energy down to the lowest common denominator. And that is a grave mistake. Because what will happen is those who are really capable will become so bored or so disillusioned with always having to go to the bottom of the paper bag and try to lift that group up, that you'll just lose all of their input. That's why Swamiji would often get a general consensus, and then he would pull out those who were really going to act and let them move according to their own energy. Now, of course, you have to make sure that you have a consensus among your team. You can't have little pockets of rebellion, but be very, very careful. One of Swami's rules of leadership, which may yet appear in this book, I'm not sure yet where it is, but he always said, give the majority of your energy to those people who are in tune with you and have the capability to carry things forward. And there's a mistake that's often made in leadership where people give the majority of their energy to the lowest factor, thinking that I have to bring the lowest factor up. I use the phrase the bottom of the paper bag. Swami remarked once that, the soggy bottom of the paper bag, when you lift the paper bag, no matter how much you've tried to work with it, it'll just remain right where it is. And the top will come off and the bottom will stay there. I'm not being judgmental, I'm just talking about human nature. And sometimes people who are, stalwart at the bottom of the bag still have something solid to contribute. But when, because that kind of conceivably methodical, even perhaps not very imaginative energy is also essential. I remember at a point when, in our context here, we needed to hire another staff person, and I was looking for another bohemian artist, who were my favorite kinds of people to work with, but we needed somebody to do the bookkeeping. And the bookkeeping had to be done because it was the bottom, but then you can call it the foundation. It was the foundation of everything else. So you need people in your organization, on your team, who will keep things together in a real straightforward way. Sometimes individuals have lots of varied characteristics, but still the energy is going to come from those with creative willpower and those with imagination. So you get those people on your side, you get the rest of them to cooperate with you. But you need to make sure that the most dynamic on your team are not harnessed to the least dynamic. And as a leader, you have to figure out ways. Swami rarely entered a major meeting without having first talked to the key people. And he would always build his support step by step. He would tend to talk individually to the people he worked with the most closely. Then the group would get a little smaller, a little larger, and those he'd already talked to would have had time to think it through and then could really contribute to the next meeting. And then when you got the small group consensus, then he would tend to go out to the larger community. And then that small group had time to think it through, and then they were able to represent it. It wasn't just Swami trying to persuade everyone else. You have to really think this through. To keep the creative energy flowing is not just a matter of luck. It's a matter of very thoughtful consideration and careful attention to the personality, the motivating factors, the nature of the people on your team, and where the movement really comes from. And then make sure that the gates are wide open for the people who really lead the energy. He says, action generates creativity, which is a really interesting point, which I was talking about before, because when you start acting, you start having experiences. And when you start having experiences, you have new input, and new input will generate new ideas. You may have thought something was going to be true, and no amount of discussion in your little group and no amount of analysis would really prove it one way or another. But you step out and have a little experience. You meet your clients. You try to launch your balloon, whatever it might be, and you realize, wow, that didn't really come out the way I thought it would. But I can see, because of what didn't work, this is what's really going to work. And your best idea may come after you start operating on what you thought was your best idea. But the courage to act, the raising of your energy, and the flow of divine grace all contribute to making it more dynamic. And then he says, almost any action is preferable to prolonged inactivity born of indecision. Swami adds another thought here. Almost any action is preferable to prolonged inactivity born of indecision. And of course, to be indecisive is a very serious shortcoming in a leader. A leader needs to have the courage of their own intuition, of their own responsibility, to say, okay, enough, I've heard enough, now we're just going to go forward. And when inactivity is born just because one doesn't have the nerve to make the decision, if you realize that I'm just asking for more studies and more discussions and more meetings and more reports just because I'm indecisive, then one has to work on one's attunement and work on one's courage. Now, of course, you can't just pretend to be decisive. And this is where all leadership comes back to our inner strength. I mean, this is where Swami started this whole book. Magnetic leaders, the magnetism of a leader. And where does that magnetism come from? That magnetism doesn't come from reading a lot of books about leadership. That magnetism comes from a deep inner connectedness to a power greater than oneself. I mean, in the context of what we're studying, which is how to be the kind of leader that is really inspired. And that inspiration has to be because the inner self is connected to a higher reality, and one's very concept of leadership is that I am here to serve the greater good, that I am here to be an instrument of divine consciousness, that I am here to serve others' highest selves as an instrument of the divine. And that's what gives magnetism and power to what we do. God bless you, my friends.